History does not always kill great powers outright. Sometimes it commits a more astonishing act. It allows an empire to fall, then strips away its memory so thoroughly that later ages mistake disappearance for irrelevance. I'm Professor Adrian Lockwell, and few cases expose that deception more clearly than the Hittites. A superpower of the ancient world, a state that stood level with Egypt, and yet for centuries seemed to have slipped almost entirely out of the story. That is the opening shock. In 1274 BC, at the Battle of Kadesh, Ramesses II did not ride north to crush some obscure tribal enemy at the edge of civilization. He collided with Hatti, one of the great powers of the age. The struggle was so significant that its aftermath did not end in mere frontier adjustment or temporary truces. Around 1259 BC, Egypt and the Hittites concluded one of the earliest known international peace treaties in history, a formal settlement between rival states that recognized each other as peers. War had established the scale of the contest. Diplomacy confirmed the parity. Egypt's adversary in battle became Egypt's partner in agreement. And yet one of these powers remained fixed in the imagination of posterity, while the other nearly vanished from it. The Hittites were the rulers of Hatti in central Anatolia, projecting power from a highland core into northern Syria, where the political geometry of the late Bronze Age became brutally clear. This was not marginal land. It was the hinge of a larger system. Whoever dominated that zone gained more than territory. They gained the roads that moved armies, the routes that carried trade, the tributaries that fed palaces, and the allegiance of vassal cities whose loyalty could tilt the balance of the Near East. In that world, geography was never passive. It was organized into leverage. That is why the Hittites matter. Their history is not an exotic appendix to Egyptian glory. It is part of the main structure of the age itself. Their kings bargained, threatened, invaded, married, and negotiated within the same arena as pharaohs and Mesopotamian dynasts. Their state understood something every powerful society eventually learns. Armies matter, but so do records, oaths, legitimacy, alliance networks, and the management of fear. Power is never only a matter of force. It is also a matter of memory, and memory depends on institutions that can survive the shocks of time. The Hittites eventually lost that protection. Around 1200 BC, in the wider disintegration known as the Bronze Age collapse, Hattusa, their capital, fell or was abandoned as the older order fractured. Once the palace system broke, the imperial voice began to dim. Once archives stopped being maintained, treaties stopped being copied, and administrative networks stopped carrying commands across the landscape, the state lost more than control. It lost continuity. A kingdom can survive a battlefield defeat. It is far less likely to survive the destruction of the machinery that tells future generations it ever mattered. Egypt retained monuments in stone and a prestige that later civilizations kept repeating. Hatti depended far more heavily on a bureaucratic and archival world that proved easier to silence. The result is one of the strangest distortions in ancient history. A power that once compelled Egypt to negotiate as an equal later became little more than a shadow in the records of others. An empire vanished first from the political map, then almost from the human mind. Only modern discovery broke that silence. At Khoi, the site of ancient Hattusa, excavators uncovered cuneiform archives that revealed not a forgotten minor people, but a literate imperial state with laws, treaties, correspondence, and strategic reach. The decisive intellectual breakthrough came in AD 1915, when Bedrich Hrosny deciphered the Hittite language. That moment was not merely archaeological progress. It was the restoration of a missing voice to the history of power. Clay tablets recovered what centuries of inherited memory had failed to preserve. A rival of Egypt returned from oblivion not through legend, but through administration, diplomacy, and state records speaking again. And that creates the real investigation. How did this empire rise high enough to force Egypt into parity at Kadesh and into treaty afterward? And how did a state so central to its own century become so faint in the centuries that followed? Those questions lead directly into the world the Hittites actually inhabited. A tightly connected international order of great kings, where Syria, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant formed a single strategic chessboard. Beyond Hatti stood a full international order. Not a scattering of isolated kingdoms, but a competitive society of courts that recognized one another, envied one another, and watched one another with relentless attention. In the late Bronze Age, Egypt, Hatti, Mitanni, Kassite Babylon, and the rising Assyrian kingdom formed the upper tier of power. Each ruled a different strategic zone. Egypt commanded the Nile and reached into the Levant. Hatti held central Anatolia and pressed towards Syria. Mitanni, at its height, dominated much of northern Mesopotamia and Syria through a network of elites and dependent rulers. Kassite Babylon carried immense prestige in Mesopotamia, even when prestige outran immediate military reach. Assyria was still climbing, but already dangerous precisely because it was dissatisfied with the old balance. This was the true setting of Hittite history, a world of major states measuring one another across frontiers, tributaries, and corridors of movement. The political language of that world reveals how sophisticated it was. In the diplomatic culture reflected in the Amarna letters and related correspondence, rulers addressed one another as great kings and as brothers. That phrasing was not sentimental ornament. It was the legal poetry of parody. To be recognized as a great king meant admission into an elite circle where rank determined marriage prospects, gift exchange, alliance value, and the terms on which insults could be answered. Ceremony was strategy in formal dress. A delayed gift could signal contempt. A marriage proposal could rearrange regional leverage. A treaty formula could define the boundary between partnership and subordination. Even rivalry followed rules because an ordered rivalry was more profitable than constant chaos. The great powers fought wars, but they also needed one another to validate status, stabilize trade, and recognize claims. That system turned on northern Syria. This was not merely contested land. It was the hinge of the entire Near Eastern chessboard, the corridor connecting Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant. Armies moved through it, caravans crossed it, tribute was extracted from it. Grain, horses, metals, timber, crafted goods, and diplomatic messages all traveled through the same arteries. Control of northern Syria gave a state buffer depth, taxation, manpower, intelligence, and access. It also gave something more subtle but equally important: leverage over the plans of every rival. A king who dominated the Syrian corridor could threaten, delay, or redirect the movements of others without striking their heartland directly. That is why seemingly modest places carried enormous strategic weight. Kadesh mattered because it sat near routes that shaped inland influence. Amurru mattered because it linked coast and interior, and its allegiance could tilt the balance between Egyptian reach and Hittite pressure. Carchemish mattered because control of the Euphrates crossings meant command over movement between Anatolia and Syria. It was not simply a city, but a gate. Aleppo mattered because old prestige and strategic location often reinforced one another. In great power politics, symbols and logistics rarely traveled separately. These cities and regions were buffers, tributaries, recruiting grounds, and diplomatic pressure points at the same time. A loyal vassal widened the strategic horizon of an empire. A defecting vassal could bring the frontier rushing closer. The maritime world was woven into this same structure. Alatia, very likely Cyprus, mattered because copper was indispensable to the bronze economy, and because maritime links tied the eastern Mediterranean to inland courts. Ugarit mattered for the same reason ports always matter in complex systems. They were commercial outlets, intelligence hubs, and diplomatic relay stations at once. Messages moved with merchants. Complaints about cargo shortages could become political issues at court. Coastal exchange and inland warfare belonged to one interconnected machine. These were not separate civilizations drifting in parallel. They were interdependent powers sharing trade circuits, diplomatic conventions, and strategic anxieties. That context destroys the old caricature of the Hittites as obscure mountain raiders appearing suddenly on Egypt's frontier. Hatti was one of the states helping define the international grammar of the age. Its rulers negotiated with peers, imposed terms on vassals, installed dynastic loyalists, and navigated a system in which coercion and diplomacy overlapped constantly. Egypt did not confront Hatti as a nuisance power. It confronted a state fully embedded in the highest level of late Bronze Age politics. The Hittites belonged at the same table, yet the elegance of this order concealed a permanent instability. The same interdependence that enriched the great powers also made them vulnerable. Every court needed recognized partners, secure trade, and dependable vassals, while suspecting betrayal in all three. Mitanni could be weakened by internal fracture and foreign pressure at once. Babylon could retain ceremonial prestige while losing strategic initiative. Egypt's magnificence could not erase the logistical burden of campaigning far from the Nile. And Assyria, still rising, watched the established order with the hard patience of a power that intended not merely to participate, but to revise the rules. In such a world, Hatti's location at the crossroads was both an advantage and a test. Geography had given the kingdom a commanding position. The next question was whether its rulers could turn that position into an empire durable enough to survive the pressures that came with it. Power in Hatti was never a gift of landscape alone. Central Anatolia offered a defensible core, but plateaus do not create empires by themselves. What elevated the Hittites above their neighbors was something far harder than winning battles. It was the slow construction of a state that tried to control violence at its center while directing violence outward with purpose. That tension defined Hittite history from the beginning. Under Hattusili I in the 17th century BC, the kingdom pushed beyond its Anatolian heartland and pressed into northern Syria. The move was strategic, not accidental. Syria was the hinge between Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant, and any ruler who wanted lasting influence had to think in corridors, not just frontiers. Hattusili understood that expansion was not simply a matter of prestige. It was a struggle for routes, tribute, and leverage over richer urban centers to the south. His successor Mursalai I carried that ambition to a scale that stunned the ancient world. Around 1595 BC, Hittite forces reached Babylon and sacked one of the great cities of Mesopotamia. The shock of that campaign lay not only in the destruction itself, but in the proof it offered. Hatti was no provincial kingdom. Its rulers could project power across the full strategic map of the Near East. But early reach did not mean internal security. In fact, the opposite often happens in rising states. Expansion magnifies glory abroad while exposing weakness at home. Mursalai I was assassinated, and what followed was not the orderly rise of a durable dynasty, but a recurring pattern of palace murder, factional struggle, and contested succession. The most dangerous frontier of Hittite power was often the royal household itself. Rival branches of the dynasty, ambitious nobles, and provincial strongmen watched every transfer of power for signs of weakness. A king could defeat distant enemies and still lose the state to intrigue at the center. That wound never fully healed. Telepainu stands at this fracture line. He matters not because he removed the problem forever, but because he recognized it with unusual clarity. His edicts sought to regulate succession and restrain the bloodletting that had turned the dynasty into a machine of self-destruction. It was not a constitution in any modern sense, nor did it end elite competition. Yet its significance is immense. It shows a Hittite ruler attempting to convert memory into law and law into stability. The lesson was unmistakable. Institutions were not ornaments of power. They were instruments of survival. A dynasty that could not govern itself could not hope to govern Syria. That insight became the foundation of later recovery. In the 14th century BC, Suppiluliuma I transformed Hatti from a vulnerable kingdom into one of the great powers of the age. His achievement was not based on reckless conquest or some mystical military advantage. It rested on an imperial method. Hittite rule expanded through treaties that tied local rulers to the king by oath, tribute, and military obligation. Hostages gave those promises weight. Dynastic marriages turned submission into kinship. Royal sons and trusted relatives were placed in major centers such as Carchemish and Aleppo, extending Hittite authority through delegated rule rather than constant direct occupation. This was an empire built in layers, flexible enough to absorb distance, but sharp enough to punish defiance. The archives at Hattusa reveal how deliberate this system was. The Hittites wrote with almost relentless precision because administration itself was a weapon. Scribes recorded treaties, precedents, grievances, border arrangements, and oath formulas that called the gods to witness. A clay tablet was more than a record. It was a mechanism of control prepared in advance. If a vassal rebelled, the king could answer not merely with force, but with a documented case that rebellion was betrayal, sacrilege, and perjury at once. In that sense, the scribal apparatus was part of the imperial battlefield. Fear mattered, but legitimacy mattered too, and legitimacy had to be written down. Military force remained essential, but it worked inside that larger system. Hittite armies used chariots effectively, and later imagination turned that fact into the old fantasy that Hittite supremacy came from a secret monopoly on iron weapons. That story collapses under scrutiny. Iron was known in the Bronze Age, but it was rare, valuable, and nowhere near the decisive engine of Hittite expansion. The true advantage was organization. Chariots mattered, but so did infantry. Fortresses secured corridors. Roads and staging points sustained repeated campaigning. Allied contingents could be assembled and coordinated over long distances. A Hittite army was dangerous not because it possessed one miraculous tool, but because the state behind it could combine mobility, logistics, diplomacy, and intimidation into a single operating system. That is what made Hatti formidable at its height. Every treaty answered the problem of distance. Every hostage answered the problem of trust. Every royal appointment answered the problem of control. Every campaign answered the problem of credibility. The empire grew through a constant negotiation between coercion and legitimacy, between the sword and the tablet. Yet a court trained to survive by oaths, dynastic bargaining, and calculated suspicion could never remain politically innocent. It learned to treat every alliance as conditional and every message as a possible trap. And that habit of caution was about to be tested by a letter from Egypt that carried the weight of an earthquake. Power at this level did not move by institutions alone. It moved through succession crises, private messages, and the terrifying gap between what a ruler hoped was true and what could actually be known. Few episodes reveal that more sharply than the affair scholars call Dakamunzu, a diplomatic crisis so strange that even now it feels like a trap hidden inside the archive. The story survives through Hittite texts, above all in later recollections from the Hittite court, so caution is essential from the start. Egypt does not narrate the episode for us in matching detail. Names remain disputed, motives remain partially obscured, but the broad outline is one of the most consequential fragments in late Bronze Age diplomacy. After the death of an Egyptian pharaoh, likely in the aftermath of Tutankhamun's death around 1323 BC, a message reached Suppiluliuma I. The Queen of Egypt, as the Hittite version presents her, declared that her husband was dead, that she had no son, and that she would not marry what the text renders as a servant. Instead, she asked the great king of Hatti to send one of his sons to become her husband and king in Egypt. That was not a romantic appeal. It was a strategic earthquake. Great powers in this age exchanged daughters, gifts, and assurances, but Egypt guarded the sanctity of its royal house with exceptional jealousy. Foreign princesses could be absorbed into diplomatic marriages elsewhere. The Egyptian throne was different. To invite a Hittite prince into that line was to suggest that the center of Egyptian legitimacy had cracked open. If the letter was genuine, then a struggle inside the Egyptian court had become so severe that one faction was willing to solve it through foreign intervention. In the language of grand strategy, this was not a marriage proposal. It was a possible transfer of influence at the highest imaginable level. Suppiluliuma did not greet the message as a gift. He treated it as a danger. That hesitation was not weakness. It was the logic of survival in a world built on deception, dynastic murder, and opportunistic diplomacy. A proposal this unprecedented could easily be bait. A Hittite prince sent south without verification might become a hostage, a corpse, or a pretext for humiliation. Kings who ruled successfully in the 14th century BC understood a hard truth. The more extraordinary the opportunity, the more carefully one had to ask who benefited from the rush to seize it. So Suppiluliuma investigated. He sent an envoy to Egypt to verify whether the pharaoh was truly dead and whether the queen's plea was real. In that decision, the entire intelligence problem of the ancient Near East becomes visible. Information moved at the speed of travel. Verification was slow. Every report passed through intermediaries with fears, ambitions, and private loyalties. Rational caution consumed time, and time itself could alter the political battlefield. A succession struggle does not wait for diplomats. The Hittite tradition says the queen wrote again, more urgently, insisting that she was not deceiving him. The desperation in that second appeal matters. It suggests that delay was not neutral. Delay strengthened her rivals. Many scholars identify the queen as Enkhesenamun, the widow of Tutankhamun, but certainty goes beyond the evidence. That uncertainty should not weaken the episode. It sharpens it. The names may be debated, yet the structure is unmistakable. Someone near the apex of Egyptian power believed the internal crisis was severe enough to invite a foreign prince into the royal house rather than submit to a domestic settlement. At last, Suppiluliuma chose to act. He sent Prince Zinanza toward Egypt. It was one of the boldest dynastic gambles of the age. Zinanza never arrived. Somewhere on the journey south, the prince was killed before he could take the throne that might have changed the balance of the entire region. The sources do not permit a neat reconstruction. There is no confession, no neutral investigation, no final verdict that can satisfy modern standards of proof. But in politics, ambiguity does not calm suspicion. It weaponizes it. For the Hittite court, the death of Zinanza looked like treachery. Egypt, in Hittite eyes, had invited a royal son into a succession crisis and then destroyed him before he could matter. The consequences reached far beyond grief. Dynastic outrage hardened policy. Whatever room may have existed for cautious accommodation with Egypt narrowed sharply. Suppiluliuma moved militarily in Syrian territories linked to Egyptian influence, and the aftermath turned darker still. Later Hittite plague texts, especially the prayers associated with Mursalai II, connect prisoners taken in these campaigns with a devastating epidemic that spread into Hatti. War carried disease back through the channels of empire. Suppiluliuma I died. Arnawanda II, his successor, also died. In a terrible sequence, one uncertain letter was followed by delay, murder, reprisal, contagion, and losses at the summit of Hittite power. This is the real anatomy of decision-making under uncertainty. States are not undone only by battles. They are also reshaped by incomplete intelligence, by motives that cannot be read in time, and by choices that are prudent in one moment and catastrophic in the next. Suppiluliuma's caution was rational. His eventual commitment was rational. Yet rational actions in a fog can still produce disaster. By the time new rulers inherited the rivalry, Hostility between Hatti and Egypt was no longer merely structural. It had become personal, dynastic, and poisoned by memory. Syria remained contested, but now the contest carried the shadow of a murdered prince and a trust that had collapsed before it was ever fully built. Under those conditions, the struggle ahead would not unfold as a routine border dispute. It would move toward a far greater collision. Suspicion had hardened into policy. What had once been managed through letters, marriages, and intimidation was now moving toward open collision, because Syria had become the measure of credibility for both courts. In this world, a great king did not simply need territory. He needed other rulers to believe that his reach was expanding and that resistance to it was costly. Kadesh mattered for the same reason certain cities matter in every age of empire. Possession of them sends a message far beyond their walls. Ramesses too understood that with unusual clarity. Early reigns are dangerous precisely because they are unfinished arguments. A new ruler may possess the crown, the palaces, and the rituals, yet still hunger for the one asset no inheritance can guarantee: demonstrated greatness. Syria offered that opportunity. Egyptian kings had long used campaigns in the Levant to convert military movement into political theater. Victory there could be carved into temple walls, proclaimed to elites at home, and broadcast to wavering princes abroad. For Ramesses, influence in Syria was not a side project. It was a stage on which legitimacy could be enlarged. If Egyptian power could be shown advancing northward, then royal prestige at home would thicken around the throne itself. Conquest, in that sense, was also domestic policy. Muwatalli too faced the same region from a harsher angle. For Hatti, Syria was not merely a proving ground for royal glory. It was the outer shield of the empire, the zone through which wealth, manpower, and political leverage flowed southward and westward. Lose influence there, and the damage would not remain local. It would spread through the whole Hittite system. Vassals would reconsider their loyalties. Rivals would detect weakness. Assumptions that had held the imperial structure together would begin to loosen. At the same time, Muwatalli could not think only of Egypt. Hittite kings always ruled under multiple pressures at once, balancing foreign danger against the old instability of Anatolian politics, rival claimants, and the perpetual need to keep regional elites aligned with the crown. He was not commanding a simple state. He was preserving equilibrium. That is why Kadesh and Amurru became so charged with meaning. Kadesh stood near the Orontes, at a strategic hinge in inland Syria, where movement, surveillance, and influence converged. It was a gate through which pressure could be applied in several directions at once. Whoever controlled it gained more than a fortress. Control of Kadesh helped shape access, communication, and the confidence of neighboring rulers. Amurru, though smaller, was equally dangerous because of its position between inland and coastal networks. Its allegiance affected the corridor linking the interior of Syria to the Mediterranean world. In an interconnected system, that kind of territory becomes multiplier power. It can strengthen supply, unsettle diplomacy, and alter calculations hundreds of miles away. This was the deeper danger of defection. When a client kingdom changed sides, the loss could not be measured simply in land. Roads became uncertain, messages slowed, tribute channels weakened, border defense became porous. Most important of all, the psychology of empire shifted. One ruler's submission reassured others. One ruler's defection tempted imitation. Kadesh and Amurru were therefore not trophies at the edge of power. They were mechanisms through which power reproduced itself. Muwatalli's relocation of the royal seat to Hattusa belongs inside this larger pattern of adaptation. The motives remain debated. Some scholars see the move as a strategic response to pressures in the south, closer to the theater where Egyptian pressure and Syrian commitments demanded attention. Others interpret it as an administrative adjustment tied to conditions inside Anatolia, or as part of a broader attempt to reposition royal authority in a changing imperial landscape. The debate itself is revealing. Whatever the exact balance of motives, the move shows a king responding to strain by shifting the center of rule. Empires that feel secure rarely relocate their weight. Empires that sense the board changing often do. The armies gathering for this confrontation also reveal the contrast between the two systems. Egyptian warfare projected the image of central command, royal initiative, and organized divisions advancing under the authority of the pharaoh. Hittite power rested on something broader and more intricate, a coalition of core forces, allied rulers, and vassal contingents tied together by treaties, obligation, kinship, and fear. That gave Muwatalli depth. He could assemble a force that represented not only Hatti itself, but the accumulated architecture of its sphere. Yet that strength carried its own risk. Coalition armies depend on politics before they depend on weapons. They must be summoned, coordinated, supplied, and kept loyal. The battlefield would display Hittite power, but diplomacy had built it. Neither side could treat the march lightly. Egyptian forces operating far from the Nile were extended by distance alone. Men, horses, chariots, rations, and information all had to move in rhythm over long lines of communication. Hittite armies faced a different but equally severe burden, concentrating multinational forces from Anatolia and Syria without losing cohesion, speed, or secrecy. Logistics stripped away the romance of kingship. Royal inscriptions spoke of destiny. Campaign reality spoke of fodder, timing, and whether an army reached the field intact enough to exploit a mistake. And mistake was now becoming the decisive word. Armies on the move rarely see the whole board. Scouts return with fragments. Local informants serve whoever seems likely to win. Commanders become prisoners of their hopes. Ramesses had every reason to trust in speed, royal daring, and the shock value of initiative. Muwatalli had every reason to trust in concentration, concealment, and the ability to let an enemy step too far forward before closing the trap. Long before the first great clash at Kadesh, the essential contest had already taken shape. Not simply strength against strength, but confidence against information. In wars between major powers, disaster often begins when one side mistakes incomplete knowledge for certainty. What followed in 1274 BC was not a clean duel between two monarchs, but a collision shaped by timing, deception, and the fatal gap between what commanders believed and what the battlefield was already becoming. Ramesses II advanced toward Kadesh with ambition equal to the moment. Egypt needed prestige in Syria, and prestige in the late Bronze Age was never decorative. It governed tribute, loyalty, and the willingness of smaller rulers to place their future beneath a distant crown. But the Egyptian march carried a structural weakness from the start. The army was divided into separate formations moving in sequence rather than as one concentrated mass. That arrangement allowed movement across long distances, yet it also meant that if the enemy appeared at the wrong moment, one part of the army could be struck before the rest could intervene. Order on the march could become vulnerability at contact. Muwatalli too built his opportunity around that weakness. He did not need a theatrical charge from the opening hour. He needed Ramesses to keep moving under a false picture of the field. Near Kadesh, the Hittite king concealed a large coalition army with notable operational discipline. This was not only a Hittite royal force, but a wider assemblage of allied and vassal contingents drawn into a single plan. Kadesh itself became more than a fortified city. It was an anchor for concealment, a screen for maneuver, and a trap for an opponent marching on confidence. Muwatalli's success began before the first major impact. It began with information control. The main narrative comes from Egyptian inscriptions, especially the poem and the bulletin, and that matters because these texts are both invaluable and deeply partisan. They present Ramesses as the voice of order confronting treachery and confusion. In that account, Egyptian command encountered false intelligence from men described as captured locals, deserters, or informants who claimed that the Hittite army was still far away. Whether those figures were genuine, manipulated, or partly literary devices crafted afterward, the strategic effect is the same. Ramesses acted on the assumption that he still had time. He did not. Only later, again in the Egyptian telling, were Hittite scouts or agents seized and interrogated, revealing that Muwatalli's forces were already massed much closer than expected, near Kadesh itself. The revelation was dramatic because it exposed more than a scouting failure. It exposed the central danger of command. Armies do not collapse only from enemy strength. They collapse when the map in a ruler's mind no longer matches the ground beneath his army. By the time Ramesses understood the scale of the threat, the Egyptian divisions were still dangerously separated. The distance between them was no longer an inconvenience. It was an opening. The Hittite strike came hard and fast. Chariot forces surged against the exposed Egyptian formations, with the division of Re especially vulnerable as it approached the area where Ramesses and the division of Ammonius were positioned. Here the battle turned from campaign to near disaster. The Egyptian camp was hit. Formations were thrown into confusion. The image of steady royal advance gave way to the much older truth of war. One successful surprise can make an orderly army look suddenly unfinished. Modern historians rightly treat the reported numbers with caution, because royal accounts magnify scale and drama, but even after stripping away inflation, the core event remains. Muwatalli achieved surprise, and the Egyptian army suffered a severe shock. Ramesses survived that shock, and that survival became the foundation of one of the most successful political narratives in ancient history. Egyptian reliefs and inscriptions transformed the king into the solitary center of resistance, the warrior abandoned by lesser men who restores order through courage and divine favor. That portrait cannot be swallowed whole, but neither should it be dismissed as pure invention. A ruler present at the crisis point could steady morale, rally survivors, and create enough cohesion to prevent complete ruin. Ramesses likely did play a real role in the recovery. Reinforcements, including forces arriving later in the battle, also mattered. Yet survival under pressure is not the same as battlefield mastery, and it is certainly not the same as strategic victory. That distinction is the heart of Kadesh. Egypt proclaimed triumph in stone because kingship required visible success. A pharaoh was not merely a commander. He was the public guardian of order itself. To admit disaster was to invite political and cosmic embarrassment at once. So the battle was fought again on temple walls, where ambiguity could be reorganized into glory. Ramesses won the story, but the map is less impressionable than propaganda. Kadesh did not become a secure Egyptian possession after the battle. Hittite power in Syria endured. The wider Hittite sphere retained its position, and the Egyptian advance failed to break that system. If the question is who produced the grander public memory, the answer is Egypt. If the question is who prevented the other side from achieving its strategic objective, the answer leans heavily toward Hatti. That is why calling Kadesh a simple Egyptian victory distorts the harder truth. It was a battle in which tactical recovery and monumental self-presentation obscured a stubborn political fact. Muwatalli had stopped Ramesses from remaking the balance of Syria. And that is what makes Kadesh so enduring. It reveals that war is never decided only where the chariots strike. It is also decided in archives, in monuments, in what a state can persuade its own world to believe after the dust has settled. Once that contest ended, the next struggle was no longer about who had looked invincible for a day, but about which empire could bear the heavier pressures already gathering beyond the battlefield. What followed Kadesh was more revealing than the clash itself. The battle had proved that spectacle and control were not the same thing. Egypt could celebrate the survival and valor of Ramesses II. Hatti could point to the political landscape that still refused to submit. Kadesh remained in the Hittite sphere. Northern Syria remained a zone of leverage, tribute, and chronic friction rather than a prize either empire could simply lock away. Distance worked against Egypt. Structure worked against Hatti. The pharaoh could not effortlessly project force deep into every contested corridor beyond Canaan. And the Hittite king did not govern the region through smooth, direct occupation, but through vassals, dynastic clients, and negotiated fear. Syria was not merely a battlefield. It was a machine for draining certainty from great powers. That reality became more urgent when the Hittite throne entered another succession crisis. After the death of Muwatalli II, the crown passed to his son Mursalai III, better known in some texts as Urhiteshib. In theory, the line of inheritance was clear. In practice, Hittite politics had rarely been governed by theory for long. Royal legitimacy in Hatti always lived under pressure from military prestige, palace alliances, and the dangerous memory of earlier coups. Hattusili III, brother of Muwatalli and uncle of the young king, was not a marginal figure waiting quietly at court. He had governed important territories, commanded armies, and built a reputation as a man of tested competence. When he moved against Mursalai III and ultimately displaced him, it was not presented as naked ambition alone. It was framed as necessary correction, the replacement of instability by experienced rule. But every usurper speaks in the language of necessity, and every rival hears the crack in the law. That crack mattered beyond the palace. Hattusili III did not only need the army and the court to obey him. He needed other great rulers to treat him as legitimate. An empire held together by treaties and subordinate kings could not afford uncertainty at the top, because doubt traveled fast through the diplomatic network. A contested sovereign invited rebellion abroad as much as conspiracy at home. Egypt therefore became central to the problem. Recognition from Ramesses II would not erase the circumstances of Hattusili's rise, but it could stabilize them. If the king of Egypt accepted him as a brother and peer, then the outer world would have a powerful reason to do the same. A secure southern frontier was not simply a military convenience. It was political oxygen for a ruler who had seized power and now had to make it appear durable. At the same time, the eastern horizon was growing more dangerous. Assyria was no longer a distant kingdom waiting for its moment. Under Adad-nirari I, Assyria had already advanced into the wreckage of Mitanni, absorbing lands and prestige that once formed part of the balance against Hatti. Under Shalmaneser I, that pressure intensified, and the Assyrian state showed increasing capacity to organize conquest with grim persistence. Under Tukulti-Ninurta I, Assyria would become still more formidable, more confident, and more openly imperial. This was the deeper strategic equation. Hatti could continue a costly rivalry with Egypt and Syria, or it could reduce one danger before another became unmanageable. Peace in the south was the price of concentration in the east. The agreement reached around 1259 BC between Hattusili III and Ramesses II was therefore not the sentimental ending of a heroic duel. It was hard calculation formalized in royal language. The treaty survives in both Egyptian and Hittite versions, and what stands out is its insistence on parity. Neither ruler appears as subordinate. Each speaks as the equal of the other. That alone was a statement of immense significance. Hatti had not been erased by Egyptian propaganda, and Egypt had not been forced into humiliation. The settlement recognized a world in which neither side could achieve decisive mastery at acceptable cost. These clauses reveal how practical Bronze Age diplomacy could be. There was mutual non-aggression, a formal renunciation of invasion across their frontiers. There were commitments of assistance, promising support if either kingdom faced attack from an external enemy. There were extradition provisions for fugitives and political defectors, because a refugee prince or displaced noble could become a weapon in the hands of a rival court. There were dynastic assurances woven into the agreement as well, an effort to give continuity legal shape. This was not peace as moral awakening. It was peace as architecture. And at the center of that architecture stood Queen Pujahipa. She was not an ornament to Hattusili's reign. She was one of its chief diplomatic intelligences. Her correspondence shows a ruler fully capable of negotiating with foreign courts, invoking divine sanction, precedent, kinship, and legal order with extraordinary control. She helped present the Hittite monarchy not merely as a power that possessed territory, but as a lawful and sacred order worthy of recognition. In a state where legitimacy had been bruised by usurpation, that work was not ceremonial. It was strategic. Armies could hold roads. Pujahipa helped hold belief. The settlement later took visible dynastic form when Ramesses II married a Hittite princess, a union often treated by later imagination as pageantry, though its meaning was colder and more important. It announced to vassals, rivals, and wavering elites that the relationship had moved beyond temporary convenience into publicly staged recognition. Peace had been made legible. Yet this was the kind of achievement that carries its own warning. Egypt and Hatti had succeeded in turning exhaustion into order, and that was no small triumph. But the precision of the arrangement also revealed how narrow the margin had become. One frontier was calmed because another was darkening. And peace on the Egyptian frontier solved one problem and exposed the scale of all the others. Hatti had gained breathing room but not safety. What followed in the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC was not the clean destruction of a mighty empire by one decisive blow. It was a system's failure. The most dangerous collapses in history rarely come from a single cause. They come when pressure accumulates across military, political, economic, and environmental fronts until the state can no longer convert authority into action. Under Tudhaliya IV, the strain was already visible. Assyria was no longer a secondary eastern rival. It had become an aggressive, expanding power under rulers such as Shalmaneser I and Tukulti-Ninurta I, pressing into the same strategic world that Hatti needed in order to remain an empire. That mattered for more than maps. A frontier loss could be survived. A loss of confidence was harder to repair. Once vassals and allies began to suspect that the Hittite king could no longer shield them, imperial control started weakening before armies even arrived. Prestige in the late Bronze Age was not decoration. It was part of the machinery of rule. That machinery had always carried an internal weakness. Hittite kingship was sophisticated, legalistic, and heavily documented, but succession was never fully secure. Dynastic rivalry had shadowed the state for generations, and every uncertain transfer of power invited opportunism across the empire. Royal relatives, client rulers, and provincial authorities could extend the reach of the center in strong years. In weak years, the same arrangement multiplied uncertainty. Indirect rule is efficient when confidence is high. When confidence falls, it becomes a network of possible defections. Material vulnerability made the danger worse. Hatti was a redistributive state. Grain, livestock, labor, tribute, and military obligations had to move across large distances through roads, depots, and loyal intermediaries. Surviving texts point to real concern over food supply and grain shipments. That detail is not administrative trivia. Empires do not live on glory. They live on logistics. If harvests failed in one region, if caravans stalled, if shipments were delayed, the consequences spread outward. Garrisons weakened. Local authorities improvised. Courts lost the ability to reward loyalty. Scarcity stopped being an agricultural problem and became a political one. This is where drought and environmental stress enter the story, but only with caution. Evidence suggests that parts of the eastern Mediterranean and Near East faced serious climatic pressure around this period. Yet drought alone does not explain why an imperial system fails. Hard years test every state. Collapse begins when environmental strain strikes institutions already burdened by war, mistrust, and overextension. A bad harvest can be endured. Repeated shortages inside a political order that depends on constant movement of supplies are something else entirely. The same was true of trade. The late Bronze Age world was deeply interconnected. Copper from Alatia, prestige goods, raw materials, diplomatic exchanges, and staple resources moved through a web linking ports, inland courts, and vassal polities. When those circuits frayed, Hatti lost more than income. It lost resilience. A connected system allows one region to compensate for the weakness of another. Once that connective tissue starts tearing, every local crisis becomes harder to contain. This is why the erosion of vassal control in Syria and Anatolia was so dangerous. These territories were not decorative possessions gathered for royal vanity. Carchemish, Aleppo, Kadesh, and other nodes formed the empire's communication lines, intelligence screen, manpower pool, and taxation base. Losing a vassal did not simply reduce the size of the empire. It blinded the center, thinned its revenues, disrupted its roads, and shortened its warning time. The map shrank, but the deeper damage was structural. Hatti was losing the web that allowed it to function as an imperial power at all. By the time Suppiluliuma II appears in the record, the monarchy was confronting converging emergencies rather than a single enemy. That is the essential point. Popular memory prefers one dramatic image, often the so-called sea people sweeping in to destroy the old order. Maritime raiding and migration may well have intensified the crisis near 1200 BC, but they did not strike a healthy and stable empire. They entered a world already weakened by Assyrian pressure, dynastic fragility, supply stress, and fraying allegiance. Predators are most dangerous when institutions are already failing. Hattusa itself, the capital that had once coordinated treaties, archives, and imperial command, was abandoned or destroyed around the broader collapse horizon near 1200 BC. That was the death of the imperial center, but not the instant disappearance of Hittite civilization. In parts of Syria and southeastern Anatolia, Neo-Hittite states endured, preserving fragments of language, rulership, and political tradition into the early 1st millennium BC. The empire died first as a unified system. Its cultural afterlife lingered in broken pieces. That is how great powers usually fall. Not with a single theatrical blow, but when shocks begin arriving faster than institutions can absorb them, and when trust decays faster than authority can repair it. Hatti was not simply conquered, it was overwhelmed by convergence. And once the state itself gave way, the next mystery became even stranger than its collapse. The verdict, then, is not subtle. The Hittites were never a historical curiosity waiting politely beneath the soil for modern scholars to notice them. They were one of the organizing powers of the late Bronze Age, a kingdom that fought Egypt at Kadesh in 1274 BC, stood opposite Egypt in the Treaty of about 1259 BC, controlled the strategic hinge of Anatolia and northern Syria, and helped define the diplomatic rules by which great kings measured one another. Their disappearance from older narratives did not merely erase one state. It distorted the entire geometry of the ancient Near East. Without Hatti, Egypt looks too isolated, Mesopotamia looks too continuous, and the age itself looks simpler than it truly was. That is what it means to say this empire vanished twice. First, it vanished as a political order. The system that held it together began to fail under cumulative pressure. Strained supply, unstable succession, weakened vassal loyalty, external rivals, and the broader unraveling that reached across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC. Hattusa fell silent, and with that silence an imperial center ceased to command. But the second disappearance was even more profound. The Hittites also vanished as a remembered civilization. Their archives were buried. Their language ceased to move through living institutions. Their political memory was not carried forward by a stable successor empire capable of preserving the whole. A superpower collapsed in life, and then collapsed again in memory. That double disappearance is why the Hittites matter far beyond the boundaries of Anatolia. They reveal that power is not only the ability to coerce, expand, or survive a battlefield. Power also depends on the systems that record, interpret, justify, and transmit authority across generations. At Kadesh, intelligence failure and deception nearly decided the battle before the battle was fully understood. In the inscriptions that followed, propaganda fought its own campaign and transformed ambiguity into royal certainty. In the treaty between Egypt and Hatti, diplomacy appeared not as the opposite of force, but as force translated into legal language, oath formulas, and mutual recognition. In the career of Hattusili III, legitimacy emerged as a strategic asset, because a ruler who must defend the right to rule governs from a position that is never purely military. And in the collapse itself, the deepest lesson became unavoidable. complex systems look most formidable shortly before their invisible dependencies begin to fail. The Hittite world did not dissolve into absolute emptiness. Neo-Hittite states endured in parts of Syria and southeastern Anatolia. Elements of language, symbolism, and political tradition survived in fragments. But the imperial whole, the unified voice of Hatti as one of the great kingdoms of its age, slipped beneath the threshold of common memory. Only when the archives of Hattusa were recovered at Bagaskoy, and only when Hittite was deciphered in 1915, did that buried voice begin to speak again. Clay tablets became witnesses from a civilization that had lost its own descendants as guardians. Archaeology did not create Hittite greatness. It restored access to it. And so the opening paradox resolves with a kind of severity. The Hittites were forgotten not because they were weak, provincial, or marginal. They were forgotten because the institutions that preserve memory proved no more immortal than the institutions that preserve power. Armies can hold frontiers. Treaties can stabilize rivals. Archives can order an empire. Yet if the archive burns, if the scribal chain breaks, if no successor world can still read the old language of authority, even a great king can fade into rumor. That is the warning left by Kadesh, by the treaty, and by the collapse that followed. Great powers do not simply fight for territory. They fight for coherence. They fight to keep logistics moving, legitimacy intact, intelligence credible, and memory durable. When those links break together, states lose more than land. They lose the ability to explain themselves to the future. The next step belongs on the end screen, because another rise and another collapse will sharpen this pattern even further. In the comments, which fails first in most great powers? Legitimacy, logistics, or information? Subscribe for the kind of long-form history that treats vanished empires not as distant ruins, but as case studies in how civilization holds together and how it disappears.